I had the pleasure of talking, and I'm going to introduce a gentleman to you guys. And I met him through this cannabis journey, and he's an awesome individual. And Mark has been very instrumental in educating me on politics in Virginia, Black politics in general, business politics across Virginia. So I want you all to help me welcome, to take over the con and share his part of today, Mr. Mark Cannady. Mark, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I guess I'm looking at the slide that I have up now. You're going to share my screen. Hold on one second. I think it is up here. Well, folks, my name is Mark Cannady, and I'm the chair of the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus. And I'm going to talk about voting rights, in particular those voting rights that are important to everyone from a local, a state, and a federal perspective. And let me share my screen as I can share some particular graphics as I talk. And I'll start out doing just that. One moment, and are we up? Don't see my desktop. Hold on a minute. Desktop number 2. That should be it. And should be able to share it. Okay, hopefully you can see that desktop. Should say voting rights on the screen. Somebody can give me a nod if that's the case. Okay, fantastic. Folks, we're going to talk voting rights. Voting rights are fundamental. As a chair of the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus, we do a podcast weekly. Been doing it for the last 56 weeks. And basically, it is all about letting people know for your businesses to flourish and for you to get
Mark, we are unable to see your screen. Only thing we see now is your actual desktop. We're not able to see the presentation.
Okay, that is, let me stop the share. Let me try to go back there again, folks. Sorry about that. Okay, now it is actually coming up. Okay, let me go to that desktop now. Let me share that desktop. What about now? Can you see it?
You're good. Thank you.
Okay, let me go ahead and do it. So, as I said, talking about voting rights is important because we're really talking about what Paul is talking about regarding business, getting things that is going to provide equity, getting things that is going to provide expungement, making sure that the policies that you need to get in place all starts with voting rights. And we have a challenge there, as people know. If they don't know, I'm here to tell you, because there's been some significant things that have changed with regard to voting rights for Americans that impact particularly the African-American community and all communities, really, if they don't have unfettered access to voting rights. So I'm going to just go through the basics. And let me go ahead and change this chart here and go to the next one. All right. First, we're going to talk about what I talk about, the fundamentals in voting rights, and talking about the separation of powers. If everybody remembers from their 12th grade class, you have separated powers in government. Here in the United States, you have your judiciary, which is responsible for your courts. You have your legislature, which is responsible for passing laws and has the power of the purse. And you also have your executive, which is your governor or your president on a federal level, which is responsible for signing and faithfully carrying out those laws. Those things have been affected as of recently. And I'm going to go first and give you a little bit of history on those things real quickly. Got my timer running here. I want to make sure I stay on track. Let's see here. Okay, let's talk about first the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited the discrimination basis on race, on color, on religion, sex, or national origin. And basically, it also forbade discrimination as far as that in hiring and promoting and firing practices. I like to show people this graphic when I talk about the basis of voting, of civil rights in this country, because one of those things that got passed in '64, and you see some of the graphics that are there, this act was passed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president at that time. You can see Martin Luther King in that picture. You can see kids that are on school buses and some of the protests that were going on at that time. But it was important to initially get this put into place. The next thing that came into place, okay, let me bring up the next chart. I talk and do this. I think this is the one right here. Excuse me, nope, that's the wrong one. I apologize. Okay. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is really one of the key things here. In 65, you basically had the act signed into law in August. LBJ signed it. It outlawed discriminating voting practices that were adopted in many southern states after the Civil War. And also a lot of northern states were doing that as well, including things, voter suppression. And back then there was literacy tests, poll taxes, and a lot of other things. Now, what you've seen since 2013, when the Supreme Court knocked down the preclearance provision that was in this Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I'll talk about in HR 4, which was the John Lewis voting coming up, it basically made all laws the same throughout the country and all U.S. territories where people were allowed to vote. That is no longer in place. And this is why we talk about voting rights on a regular basis and what we need to do to get that back into place. The next thing is the Fair Housing Act, which happened in 1968. The Fair Housing Act expanded on the previous acts prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, financing, and housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and also later included in Title VIII for handicap, family status, things when people talk about back then, it had more to do with single family homes and things like that, but that also includes LGBTQ communities and different things that people did not necessarily consider mainstream at that time. But now everything that flows from this basically came from the laws that we now have on the books that cover things like Roe versus Wade and other things that were passed that are all based on that Trinity foundation of civil rights. So this is important that we get these back into place. Let me bring up the next chart, which is going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about the John Lewis Act, the John Lewis Voting Right Advancement Act. And the John Lewis Voting Right Advancement Act, what it did was it put preclearance back into the law, or tried to do that. And the preclearance provision simply meant that if there were going to be any sort of changes to voting rights in this country, it had to go through the Department of Justice. It had to happen at least 180 days before an election. And it also gives the government more authority to send federal observers in, monitor jurisdictions for potential risk and discrimination. This was passed in the Congress. I'm going to go to the next one here. Right, moving along quickly here. Excuse me, folks. Pardon me, I'm a little bit of technical difficulty, but we'll get it up here in a second. My screens have multiple screens running here. Let's see. Well, the next one is the Freedom to Vote Act, was an additional law that was passed in the Congress. And the Freedom to Vote law that was passed in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, basically built upon HR 4, which was the John Lewis Act. HR 1 is Freedom to Vote Act, and it also included additional things passed in the Congress. And then after that, the latest one that went to the Senate, and I'll bring that up quickly, is the Senate Bill 2747. And Senate Bill 2747, basically what happens is each house in the Congress passes their own versions of the bill. The one that that came up is 2747 that did not pass because you have folks like Manchin in West Virginia and Sinema in Arizona that would not vote to break the filibuster, but the law that was the agreement that they came up with is it included things like national automatic voter registration. It prohibited bans on voter roll purging and federal partisan gerrymandering. It also strengthened ethics in all three branches of the government. And also it also required candidates to disclose at least 10 years of tax returns and prohibited members of Congress from using tax dollars to settle sexual harassment cases. Furthermore, the bill was curbing corporate influence on super PACs and required them to disclose the donors. Government contractors had to disclose their political spending, and it also prohibited coordination between super PACs and other governments. That Senate bill 2747 had a lot of things in it, and that particular bill was extremely important because that bill basically had a lot of what was in the Freedom to Vote Act and a lot that was in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act as well. Now, let me go ahead and just say real briefly about this and trying to preserve time here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back on screen here. Why this is important on a federal basis, because in the state and also affects the state of Virginia, because obviously what gets passed on a federal level now is passed in all states have to follow it. So that's why that's important. And the other piece is when we talk specifically, when we look at state government, what Paul was talking about earlier, by being active in your state and having unfettered access to voting rights, because when you vote on a state level, if you're having problems voting by any sort of voter suppression, then the equity and the expungement laws and other different laws that are affected that you would like to get in Virginia, your delegates and your Senate and the governor to pass, clearly you're not going to get that done if you can't even get to vote. So voting is fundamental, as I tell people. It is to a democracy, it is like air is to your body, and you must have unfettered access so we can do it. So what is the call to action? The call to action is, say, on the federal level, is make sure you're calling your representative and say, hey, I know about these laws that were passed in the House of Representatives, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I know about the Freedom to Vote Act. I know that was passed. I know about Senate Bill 2747. And we're going to continue to fight to make sure that those laws get passed, they get to the president's desk so the president can put his signature on it. A lot of people are complaining the feds or the Biden Harris administration isn't doing anything on this, but as we know in government and in democracy, it's, one man, one vote. It's all about the numbers game. We don't control the Senate as Democrats. What we do is we basically have a 50-50 split. So that's not control. Because if somebody basically decides not to follow what the rest of the party wants to do, as the examples was mentioned in Sinema, basically now you've lost 2 votes. What you would normally have in the 50-50 Senate is the vice president, who is also considered the president of the Senate, would come in and break a tie. Same thing happens on a state level. The lieutenant governor would come in and break a tie, and a bill would get passed and get to the executive's desk for signature, and it would go into law. So how do we resolve this problem? Vote. Elect more Democrats, elect more people who have the same point of view that you have and the same ideals that you want to do. So in Virginia, to get things done in the House of Delegates and to get things done in the Senate, it is important that you get out there and vote on a state and local and federal level so that we can get the sort of policies in place that favor African-American business and the cannabis business, as well as other policies and laws that are important to you. There's my snapshot. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome, Mark. I appreciate that. And man, you emphasized that you kept beating it home. Participation in politics. We want you all to understand that he said, make a phone call, use this thing, that the thing that so many people allow them to get distracted by, you can actually weaponize for the betterment of your economic position and make a phone call and work to be included in this process. So I appreciate that, Mark, and looking forward to getting back on your podcast and many other things, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me here to provide this information to the audience.
I appreciate it. Awesome. Okay, we're going